Thank you for having me. So I didn't use "The Computer Says No" as my title. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I think the internet can make us all better providers for our patients. And before I get too far into that, I thought it was kind of important to maybe talk about some of the problems we have with traditional lecture. Kind of like what I'm doing right now, right? So if you could just bear with me, I'm going to oversimplify this just a little bit. But traditional lecture kind of has this kind of form to it. Teacher standing up, audience and students listening. It's usually unidirectional. Again, very oversimplified. Good teachers are able to make that bidirectional. We have Casey over here who's looking at the Twitter feed, so we have other ways of communicating with the teacher in this case. But if we could just oversimplify it. Now, I don't think this is the best way to get information across. I don't think it's the best way to learn, but yet it's still so pervasive in medicine. Some other issues we have are that this is what the traditional model looks like, is me not lecturing to an audience, but to an orchard of apples staring back at me. And I have no idea what you're doing on those apples. Are you tweeting? Are you checking your email? Are you writing to your loved ones? I have no idea. Do I have your attention? Do I not really have your attention? And so this is one of the big problems when you look at traditional lecture models now. When you look at back to Aristotle, Socrates, they didn't have MacBooks or iPhones back then, right? When Martin Luther King was giving his great speeches, it's not like iPhones were prevalent or PowerPoint. Right? People just spoke, and then people actually listened. It's changed now. Technology has changed the way we get information. The other issues I have with lecture are that they're not on your time as the learner. They're on my time as the speaker or as the conference people who put this together. But don't worry, it's not their fault. This is self-inflicted because you paid for these tickets. Other issues are you can't rewind a lecture. If for some reason you get distracted, you're talking to somebody, and I say something that is the crux of my talk or something very important, and you missed it, that's it, you missed it. I think this is why we're starting to see more podcasts and blogs and people doing online learning with watching lectures online, because it's on your time when you're ready to focus, when you are caffeinated, or whatever your time is for learning. And then finally, if you can, I've really oversimplified this, but if you can imagine a bell curve, learners come in all flavors. There's some that are going to be more advanced on topics and others that are going to be less advanced. Now, me as the educator, how do I get that information across? Where on this bell curve am I supposed to lecture at? In the middle where I get the majority, but then what about the people who are advanced or the people who aren't as advanced in that topic? You miss out on people no matter where you shoot for. So there's got to be a better way to use things like technology to individualize learning, which is what we're all doing anyways. When you look around in the real world, you can't but miss this image. Everybody's down in their phone. People go out and hang out. They don't even talk to each other anymore. They're tweeting each other back and forth, even though they're standing right in front of each other. We use this technology to get information about world events, about weather, stock prices, whatever you want to use it for, but it's instantaneous, that information. And many of us have now bought into this concept of FOMED, free open access medical education, and the use of these social media platforms to have online discussion, regardless of geography, regardless of time zone, regardless of specialty or what you do in healthcare, so that we can get the best information out, have discussions about it to provide the best care for our patients. So if I could add a piece to that oversimplified model, I would add this internet component. And so really there's two questions now. Does adding this internet component really make us better healthcare providers? Does it really change outcomes for our patients? I'm in the camp that says yes. Not aware of any robust studies, but I can tell you I've had emails and text messages and phone calls, and I know other people in the phone world have had the same about how getting that information out has really changed the way people care for their patients. The second question is, well, if it works and you really believe it, how do you best apply it? And so what I thought I would do for the rest of this talk is give you 5 ways that I've implemented this into my teaching, both in the classroom as well as by the bedside, to really help improve learning and improve ultimately patient care. So my first idea is this concept of knowledge translation. So let me just give you a quick definition, but it's basically something new comes out, a new study, a new novel concept, something that changes the way you would do something. Imagine a new iPhone came out. The time it takes for that new product, new idea, whatever, to get disseminated amongst the ranks, there's a period of time for that to happen. Some of that is because it takes time to get into our lectures, where we learn in school. Some of it is it's not easy to access. And some of it is some people are kind of naysayers at the beginning, want to wait for a lot of the kinks and bugs to come out before they adopt something. So if I could just make this simple analogy, this is a business innovation curve. So a new product comes out, and then there's this kind of time until that concept or that product gets taken in, okay? So I'm going to go backwards on this curve. So the first thing is textbooks. I've written several chapters in a textbook, and it literally takes about 5 years before that book ever hits the market. You write the chapter, it gets edited, they want it in a certain version or format. There's how many ever hundreds of chapters. The books are basically doorstops now as far as I'm concerned. I use everything on my iPad now. I read everything on my iPad or my iPhone. I'm not saying textbooks are dead. What I'm saying is they're great for foundational knowledge, for a core, right? And we all need to have that. But if you want to know the cutting edge stuff, the stuff that's coming out today that changes how you take care of patients, this is a little dated. So then the next thing I hear is people tell me, well, that's why I use journals. Well, that's great, and I'm talking paper journals, not online journals. That's great, except how many hundreds and thousands of journals are there? How many hundreds and thousands of publications? And which ones are the ones that are going to actually change the way you care for your patients? I don't have time to read through thousands of publications. I don't know about anyone else. And so we've all figured out ways of getting this information out as quickly as we can and finding it as quickly as we can. But again, this is a little old. And then there's conference like what you guys came to today, right? But how many conferences do you go to in a year? How much money does that cost? Time away from your family, time away from work. How much does that cost? How much information do you get from that one conference that actually changes your clinical practice? I got to tell you, most of the time when I'm coming to these conferences, it's great to hear the speakers. The information is excellent, but it's also really good to catch up with old friends in person instead of via Twitter. So again, it's a slow way of getting information out. It is definitely faster than the other two, but I think there's a better way. And I think that's the use of the internet. Specific example, so in the adult literature, this new randomized clinical trial called the ENDOW trial just came out. It's a randomized clinical trial, the first one in the emergency department on the use of apneic oxygenation for rapid sequence intubation. It's not even hit paper yet. It's been online for maybe 2 weeks, and there's been no less than 5 blog posts, 3 podcasts, interview with the lead author. I myself have had conversations with the lead author who I did not know before the study of this publication. It hasn't even made it to a conference yet for people to talk about. It hasn't been published in a paper journal, and it's certainly not made it to a textbook. I think the internet is a very powerful way to get this information quickly, so knowledge translation. Now, if you're not doing any of these things, then you just don't care. You don't care about the care you're giving your patients. You don't care about improving yourself. You are just stagnant. Whatever you finished in terms of your knowledge and training, that is probably what you're left with if you're not using any of these modalities. So idea number 2, flipping the classroom. So flipping the classroom is a cool concept. It's basically, instead of giving the lecture during class, you give whatever your lecture is going to be as pre-course material or pre-lecture material, and then you answer questions and you work on different problems. You have more of a back and forth with the learners, okay? My only issue with the flipped classroom is how do you get learners to buy in and actually do the flipped classroom material? Because a lot of times what I found when I've done this is I'm going back through the stuff that I asked them to do before the class. And so I'm wasting some time with that. So how do you get that buy-in? I've done this with DKA. This is a blog post I've written on REBELcast called DKA Myths, where we go through 5 different myths. I have all the PubMed links and everything, like exactly like I would give a lecture. I asked the residents to read that, and then during our hour, instead of me standing up there and lecturing, I actually gave them patient cases, and we walked through the management of how to go through DKA. Do you bolus insulin? Do you give bicarb? Do you check VBGs or ABGs? Does potassium matter when you start your insulin drip? Things like that. And so it was really nice because the people who didn't know as much about the topic, I was able to answer their questions, and the people who knew a lot about the topic, I was able to answer their questions. So I'm no longer shooting for the middle. Idea number 3, spaced repetition. So there's this concept of the forgetting curve. So a new idea gets given to you. So spaced repetition is the new idea I'm giving you. Over the course of time, there's just this natural decay of forgetting that new concept I just taught you. We all agree on that. Dr. Ebbinghaus is the one who coined the term, where he memorized a bunch of syllables back in the 1800s, and then as he was forgetting those syllables, he actually mapped out the numbers. The numbers themselves don't matter. I've read 10% all the way to the other side, but it doesn't matter. The point is there's a decay. So what spaced repetition does is, instead of letting that decay happen, you augment this at some point by giving a reminder. And by giving that reminder, you force the learner to have to retrieve something, some information, something you taught them at that original concept idea. And by doing that, forcing them to have to make that effort of pulling that piece of information, you augment that forgetting curve. So now they remember a little bit more. You can send a second reminder, augment it some more. Now, I did this with something called the REVERT trial. This was basically using a modified Valsalva maneuver versus the standard Valsalva maneuver to convert stable SVT. This is a really cool paper that was published a couple years ago. I gave the lecture to the residents. It was a cardiovascular topics lecture. And then 4 days after I gave the lecture, I sent this infographic and a video of how to do the modified Valsalva maneuver. I've had probably over 20 or 30 emails, text messages, phone calls from those residents, that group of residents I taught, about a time that they used this maneuver and it worked. They said I basically did a mic drop and I walked out of the room. I don't know if it was the spaced repetition or I made that big an impact the first time, but the point is now 2 years after this study's been published, I'm still getting notifications from those residents, or registrars as you guys call them, about how that made such an impact on their care of patients. So there's something about recall, and the question I always get for spaced repetition is, when is it time to do the spaced repetition? And it's not really a simple answer. It's long enough that there's some forgetting, but not so long that they completely forget. Because if they completely forget, they have to relearn the concept, so it defeats the purpose of it. I will tell you that at a minimum, there needs to be a sleep cycle, or 24 hours, from the time that you tell them the information, because there is something about when we sleep, how we store information in our brains. If you don't let them have that sleep cycle before you give them that reminder, you're just using short-term memory. You're not really using long-term memory. So there needs to be a sleep cycle somewhere in there. And then you probably have a buffer. You probably have several-day buffer. And I don't have an exact answer because I'm not sure any of us really know. But if you wait for more than a week or 2 weeks, it's probably too long. Idea number 4, this is one of my favorite things to do, is conducting surveys. So there's 3 ways you can go about this. One of my favorite ways is, before I'm about to give a lecture, I send out a SurveyMonkey online survey to my residents, to the faculty, to the advanced practitioners, so the PAs and nurse practitioners. And this particular one was, what agent do you use for rate control for stable AFib? And you can see the majority of them chose calcium channel blockers, excuse me. This is really neat before you give your lecture because now you know what your audience thinks. So you can either re-emphasize the fact that most of them are using calcium channel blockers, or you can find scenarios where beta blockers might be better. And so you're really honing your lecture to the questions that they need answered. I built this, by the way, on PowerPoint, this little infographic. My other favorite thing to do is use Poll Everywhere. It's free, it's online, and you can embed the polls into your PowerPoint presentations. And then people answer by texting in the answer, so you have to have Wi-Fi for it to work. The free version allows you to have 40 people. The more expensive versions can get you more, but in the end, even 40 people answering in an audience is a nice punch biopsy of what your audience in general is thinking. So this was obviously after I gave the lecture on modified Valsalva. 60% of people said they would do modified Valsalva. Interestingly, there was still people that chose adenosine and standard Valsalva despite the lecture. Were they really listening? But it's a nice time to answer questions. Why did you guys pick Valsalva or adenosine over modified Valsalva? And then finally, there's this pick-to-chart, also free. As you get information from people, you can build your infographics through this online program. Really easy to do. You can send the messages out on social media platforms or however you want to do the reminders. And then my final idea, and this is probably more of an on-shift idea, is what I like to call just-in-time learning. So this is for those rare procedures that you don't get to do all the time, but then you have a patient that comes in and you need to do the procedure. Or if you have a student or registrar working with you that doesn't know anything about the procedure, you can direct them to an online video to watch before you actually perform the procedure so they can get the basics of it. So there's a lot of resources out there, but two of my favorites are EMRAP HD and New England Journal of Medicine. They have a nice series of videos that you can search, and you can find the videos that you need. So as an example, let's say I have a student that I want to teach how to do a posterior shoulder injection. Well, EMRAP HD has a great video where they go through the anatomy, what are the landmarks you're looking for, what kind of needle, what kind of lidocaine, or you guys call it lignocaine, whatever you guys call it here, that you need to use in order to do that procedure. So then they see one, then they get to see you actually do one in real life, and then maybe in the future they actually get to do one. Now for you as a provider, maybe shoulder injection is not that rare procedure, but what about something like a lateral canthotomy? I've only done 2 of these in my career, both on cadavers, one in residency and one 3 months ago at SMAC during the cadaver workshop. People are going to come in with a retrobulbar hematoma, and they're going to need this. This is a vision-saving procedure, and it's not okay to be like, I don't know how to do this. You find that video online, you watch that video, it walks you through the steps of how to anesthetize them, what are the ligaments you need to cut, what are the steps that need to happen. 3-minute video, vision-saving procedure for the patient. So those are my 5 ways that I've incorporated this in my career so far, in my teaching. It's improved me as a physician. It's certainly, I hope, improved my learners, and it's definitely helping my patients. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Sal. You successfully confirmed my biases around the internet. So one thing we could see from Twitter is that neonatal resuscitation is pumping. Don't forget the bubbles. But I'm sure Casey's managed to tease something out to extend on your talk, Sal.
Yeah, so one of the questions which I have for you, and it came from the audience as well, was how do you go about enforcing that flipped classroom? I remember when I was a med student, I was in fear that the lecturer would, flay me alive if I hadn't done the reading. In the modern age, that doesn't happen. How do you go about enforcing that?
Yeah, it's a tough question, actually, and one that a lot of us try and answer. With the residents, I've just basically start talking to them and give them reminders. So kind of like a spaced repetition of reminders. Maybe they get busy or they just forgot to do it or they're being lazy. But what I found is giving them some spaced repetition like a week or 2 weeks before and kind of spacing that out over the time before your lecture and maybe even the day before, you tend to get more of a buy-in. So you get a larger percentage of them that have actually done it. That's one method that I've used. I'm always interested to hear other methods, but that seems to work, just giving them the reminder. If you send it to them too early, they tend not to do it. If you send it too late, they tend not to do it. So you try and get as many of them as you can with multiple reminders.
Okay, thanks.
I guess the other thing I had to add on there, I'll wait till you finish swallowing.
Yeah, it's okay.
The other question I had is, you referred to using your existing platform, REBELEM, and the podcast and stuff. I'm conscious a lot of people in the audience won't necessarily have their own blog or podcast to use as a vehicle for this. Have you got any suggestions around some readily available stuff that doesn't involve all the hosting requirements and stuff of a blog?
So, I mean, I think a lot of us have like cloud accounts now. So like iCloud or Google Drive, and you can literally create a Word document that has all the same things a blog post or a podcast would, and you could share that folder with your learners. It's free to do, it's easy to do, you don't have to have your own platform. I know some people have actually built their own communities just on a social media platform, like Google+, for example. And they'll build this locked community where only the people in that class can participate. And so it's functioning like a blog, but it's not actually a blog. But cloud services, I think, is probably the easiest answer, is you upload something to the cloud, and then you share that folder with them with the information that they need.
Awesome.